And the time for the candidates chess tournament 2024 is here, and we're underway today. And let's get started. Let's jump right in. First of all, I'll tell you about the website. The candidates 2024 website is here, and I'll go ahead and post that in the chat for you guys. We'll get that posted in the chat in a minute. But the open tournament, you can click on the website here, candidates2024.fide.com. You can look at the players, you can look at the results, the cross table, everything that is here that you would need to know about. So I just wanted to make you aware of that from the get go. The first game we'll be looking at will be between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Najat Abbasov from Azerbaijan, who qualified by winning the World Cup last year. And Jan Nepomniachtchi obviously was the qualifier last year. And okay, so let's dive right into it. Let's check out. This was the least eventful game, so we'll start with it first. Abasov was playing white. Nepomniachtchi is black. Abasov starts with queen pawn d4, and Nepomniachtchi declares that he wants to play maybe a Indian defense with knight f6, but after c4, e6, knight c3. This is inviting the Nemzo Indian defense. There was a couple games today that could have been Nemzo Indians, but the black player didn't go for it in this position. Nepomniachtchi instead chooses d5, which is more or less a transposition to the Queen's Gambit declined, and which can start by d4 and c4 and e6 and transpose this way. So in this position, bishop to g5, white's pinning the bishop on or the knight on f6 to apply more pressure to the light squares in the center. Black breaks the pin while developing his king side with bishop e7. White continues normally with e3. Now that he's got the bishop outside the pawn structure, here he wants to play the move e3 so that he can continue to develop, the rest of his pieces. So h6 was played, putting the question to the bishop, as they call it, and the bishop comes back to h4. Now in this position, the line that Nepomniachtchi goes in for d takes c4 is known as pretty much a drawing mechanism. This is the reputation this move has. If he wanted to play more interesting, he could have played castle, knight f3, b6. This is known as the Tartakower Makaganov Bondarevsky variation, also referred to as the TMB. This is similar to the game the famous game Bobby Fischer versus Boris Spassky, Game 6 of the 1972 match. So here Nepomniachtchi goes for d takes c4. So he's giving up the center. White obviously responds, bishop takes c4, capturing the pawn back, and immediately Nepomniachtchi hits the center with c5. And if white was to take on c5, obviously this is just symmetrical pawn structure. Black could simply trade queens, capture back on c5 with eventually, or he doesn't even have to do it immediately, but he'd eventually capture back on c5 with a much symmetrical pawn structure. And but in this case, white decides to accept an isolated pawn by playing knight f3. And after c takes d4, e takes d4, this pawn on d4 is what's called an isolated pawn, but not necessarily weak in the middle game, can be a strength. as it gives you in the middle game a space advantage. In the end game, it tends to be a weak pawn, but in the middle game, you have a space advantage, and it gives you control over key squares in the center. So, for instance, if white was to capture knight takes d4 because he's worried about his structure, um, after a series of moves, just normal developing moves, you can see that the structure, the pawn structure is completely symmetrical. Both sides have the same amount of pawns on both sides of the board. Both sides have some influence in the center. There's not much going on here. And then there's this key move, knight h5, which aims to trade off the dark square bishops and make black's game a lot easier to play. And this is a key move in a lot of variations, knight h5, and white really can't uh, move the bishop back here. He doesn't want to give up a bishop for a knight and allow black to keep the bishop pair advantage, as they say. So in the game, he played e takes d4. Abasov played e takes d4, except in the isolated pawn. Knight c6, castle, castle, rookie, bringing the rook to e1 and hitting this square on e6, preventing black from playing e5 and putting pressure on the center. So the space advantage given by the d4 pawn as opposed to the e6 pawn gives white's pieces a little more mobility in the middle game. So he's trying to avoid piece exchanges and mobilize his pieces to the best squares. Black plays a6, which is a typical move in an isolated pawn position. And here white chose rook c1. Rook c1 is not that much of an ambitious move, I would say. Maybe more ambitious would have been a4 to stop black from playing b5, because black would like to play b5. Whoops, sorry. Okay, it can go away already. All right, so black would like to play b5 and put his bishop here since it's blocked by the pawn on e6. But a4 stops that. So then he has to settle for bishop d7. White plays queen e2, and even here, black. So white has the intention of playing moves like rook d1 and going for this d5 break. So black has a very good, strong move here. Again, knight to h5, as mentioned earlier. And white's pretty much inclined to exchange the dark square bishops, and black being careful not to run into this. Like if he would have taken with the queen, for example, d5 would be a very strong move. So he just takes with the knight, and after knight e5, which white's attacking this knight, the knight simply goes back to f6, and black secured sufficient control over the d5 square and has nothing particularly to worry about. He'll be able to bring the rook to c8 and maintain control over the position. Most likely follow it up with moving a knight to d5, putting his queen on e7, etc. So in the game, he played rook to c1 instead, and then after b5, bishop to b3, bishop b7. Black has nothing to concern himself about here. It's just an equal position. There's no the one thing I will say is that once you put the bishop here, you just want to be a little bit leery about these squares e6 and f7. But in this position, white wasn't ambitious at all and decided to take on f6 and just play d5 and go in for this position. And after knight f6, queen d4, as you can see, the players are pretty much just forcing everything off the board. He did have a bishop versus knight situation here, but black doubling the pawns here is not going to make a significant difference in the position, as the pawns on b3 and b2, even though doubled, are not exposed to an attack, so therefore they're not really weak anyway. Um, And if he doesn't take on b3, white could simply play knight c5 next, attacking a6, and then if bishop takes a2, simply take on a6, and it's pretty much everything coming off the board. So in this position, after rook d1, rook c8, rook d2, king f8, the kings come to the center, and there's not much to be done here. They just repeated moves, and we had our first draw of the day. This was the first game that ended, and we'll move on to our next game. Oh, I need to open that up again. Let's close this one. I'll save that real quick. Okay. This one didn't open properly for some reason. I thought I checked that. Okay. So the second game that ended in a draw. Oh boy. This thing. Let's try to get this. Right, so there's the live book. For some reason, this game's being difficult with me. Bear with me. Sometimes you have to open it a couple times. Okay, I'm not gonna concern myself too much about it. We got everything open here. So, all right. So this game was between two Indian players. Gukesh was playing the white pieces, and Santosh Gujrathi Vidit was playing the black pieces. I'm probably butchering her name, so excuse me for that. So in this game, Gukesh playing white played queen pawn d4, and Vidit decided to play d5, which is considered double queen pawn. Usually, as you've seen in the previous game with knight f6, there's a lot of different Indian defenses. You'd have King's Indian, Nemzo Indian, Grunfeld, all Indian defenses that usually start with the move knight f6. So in this game, we had double queen pawn, and the move c4 is called the Queen's Gambit. And there's different ways to play against the Queen's Gambit. You can accept the pawn, what's called the Queen's Gambit accepted. You can play as in the game e6 with a drawback that it shuts in the bishop on c8. Or you can play what's called the move c6, which is called the Slav defense. Okay, so c4, e6, knight c3, c5 is called the Tarrasch defense, and is distinguished from the semi-Tarrasch. In the semi-Tarrasch, black first plays knight f6, so that after knight f3, c5, this is called the semi-Tarrasch because if white takes on d5, black can capture back with the knight instead of the pawn. In the Tarrasch, you're kind of accepting that you could be straddled with an isolated pawn. Not a big deal, but in the Tarrasch, you're accepting an isolated pawn, and in the semi-Tarrasch, you're not. That's the difference. So here, white plays e3 after knight f6, knight f3, knight c6. You see a perfect symmetry. Everything is symmetric so far. This tends to usually favor the player that moves first, obviously. Here, white decided to play a3. What is the idea behind the move a3? Well, the idea is that eventually white would like to take this pawn. You notice that it's all about this bishop on c1. It's stuck behind this pawn on e3. So eventually what white would like to try to do is play d takes c5, and then when black captures back with a bishop, play the move b4 so that he gains a tempo to develop his bishop to b2 on the next move. Here black plays a6. He's pretty much got the same idea. He wants to play d takes c4, and when white captures back with a bishop, play b5, and then put his bishop on b7 because the bishop's not going to be able to come out this way, right? So um, an idea of that would be if black was to just develop normally with bishop e7, d takes c5, just to illustrate that, and then the bishop goes to b2, and you have a good game. So here, knight to c6. After knight c6, d takes, or I'm sorry, a3, a6 for black. Move d takes c5 was played. Bishop takes c5, b4, bishop to d6, and there's a lot of moves that have been played in this position. In this particular game, Gukesh goes for the move rook a2. Now, what is the idea behind rook to a2? Well, the thing is that there tends to be a lot of liquidation that will occur in the center of the board. And what white tries to do in other lines, like for instance, in this position, if white plays the move bishop to e2, then black, after playing d takes c4, can make white move the bishop twice successively. And white tries to avoid that because what he wants to do by playing rook a2 is move the rook to the d line. He knows the bishop's going to b2 anyway because of the e3 pawn. But if he can move the rook to d2, then he discourages black from playing the move d takes c4, obviously, because there's a double attack on the bishop on d6 that stands behind the pawn, which would be subject to capture. And for that reason, the move rook a2 is very interesting. It has been played before, so it's not a novelty. There were several novelties in this first round, but this game did offer a novelty actually here in a second. Black, knowing that the rook is coming to d2, decides to exchange a pair of pieces starting with knight e5, which is a very accurate move. There was a game where black decided to castle instead, and after rook d2, his position became a little bit difficult. Queen e7, bishop e2, rook d8, and then the move c5 came, which is a very, very strong move. And after several more moves, you can see black's a little bit cramped. He doesn't the bishop on d7 doesn't have mobility, and it's hard for black to realize the move e5 because of the pressure that's being asserted on the d5 square. So in the position, knight e5 was played, rook d2, and after knight takes f3, white accepts a damaged pawn structure with g takes f3. Now you may ask, well, what's the reason for that? And for instance, I don't know if queen takes f3 been played. So what's the problem with queen takes f3? Maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable for white because of this threat to play bishop to g4 is my first inkling. But there is the move knight takes d5. Oh, this must be the point, e4. Something along these lines. So in the game, okay, so in the game, knight takes f3 was a novelty. This had never been played before. There had been a previous game here between two GMs that went queen to c7, but after c5, white had pretty nice advantage that went like, say, knight f3, gf3, bishop to e5, attacking the knight on c3. And after bishop b2, defending the knight, black played the move d4 and got pretty nice play by attacking the rook. He gives up a pawn, but as you can see, white's development, and pieces are kind of stuck. So black, achieved a good compensation for the pawn. Um, the game went castle d5. E takes d5. Queen to d4. Bishop to h6, rook g1. And queen takes h2. And now, as you can see, black's threatening bishop h3. So very complicated, but white did win this game. So in this particular game, it's probably wise that black doesn't repeat the moves of a former grandmaster game. So he chose this knight f3 line. G takes f3. So black castles in this position. The bishop comes to b2. And this is all about developing, putting the pieces on the best squares. Now, in this position, black realizes that he can't really play in the center. These pawns are pretty much stuck where they're at due to the pressure that white exerts on d5. And he doesn't really want to make moves on the king side either to weaken the king side, because a lot of these pieces with the open g file and such can, he could come under heavy fire. So what he realizes is he has to start some sort of counterplay. He has this bishop stuck on c8. Sorry. I don't know why this thing keeps doing this. Okay, so the bishop is stuck on c8. The rook's stuck on a8. He tries to liberate the queen side by playing the move a5. And this is typical. Your opponent puts a pawn, advances a pawn, and then you try to attack it with one of your own pawns to create a weakness. So if you could imagine, if it was black's move again, he would take on b4 twice. So he's trying to make a weakness out of the white queen side. In this position, white played c takes d5. Gukesh did have a better option, I thought, with the move b5, which keeps the queen side closed. It's true that queen e7 attacks the pawn on a3, but I don't think that the pawn on a3 is, for instance, after c takes d5, it appears like black's losing the pawn in the center, but he's actually not, because he has this nice move, rook to d8. And then, for instance, if d takes e6, bishop takes e6, and black has a very nice compensation here for a pawn, to say the least. It's going to be very difficult for white. These bishops are staring down here. And I'll give a sample variation of how things could go wrong. Let me see here. Not sure what happened to my analysis. I think this is the game I had originally lost my analysis. a5, cd5. Okay, so e5 was played. But going back here for a second. Okay, so after b5, queen e7, cd5, rook d8, d takes e6, bishop takes e6, bishop to e2, bishop to e5. Yeah, so this could get a little bit dangerous for white because of the damage to the king side. He has to be very, very careful. Black does have full compensation, though, here. The mobility, lead and development and such fully compensate for the pawn. And it's not even clear in this position that white will even be able to keep the pawn, because this pawn on b5 is most likely going to be weak later. So in the game, after c takes d5, black chose to just allow white to keep the pawn and play e5. so that he would have mobility for his pieces. This is a typical idea to allow your opponent to keep an extra pawn, because notice that the pawn, now that the pawn's on d5, the white pieces don't have access to d5. But you do have to play energetically when you do this, because otherwise, uh, if the player with the extra pawn consolidates the position fully, and takes away your counterplay, then he'll just be a pawn up and be able to win the game. I thought that a takes b4 was also interesting. One line would go d takes e6, b takes c3, e takes f7, king h8, rook takes d6. Attacking the queen comes to c7, the bishop comes to c1. But this position probably didn't appeal to Gukesh, since the bishop on c1 is really not active, and the pawn on c3 is quite annoying. It's not clear exactly how that. And then, black, after taking on f7, has pressure on the f file, which is quite annoying as well. So he avoids that. He plays the move e5. Then knight to b5 was played, attacking the bishop. Black was applying pressure to b4, threatening to take twice. So now if a takes b4, he wants to first, which happened in the game, a takes b4. You take the bishop on d6, and then after queen takes d6, a takes b4, queen takes b4. The material equality is restored. However, the difference here is that white has passed pawn on d5. Okay, once again, it's extremely annoying. Okay, sorry about that. I keep hitting the Windows button instead of the Alt button. So here, queen c2 was played, and this is a very interesting position. There was a lot of different things here that could happen. The rook on d2 is pinned, so it was possible for black to take on d5, but white would play bishop takes e5, and after bishop e6, queen b2. It's difficult for black to avoid exchanging queens now, because there's a double attack. You're attacking the queen, you're attacking g7. So if the queen was to move away, then the pawn g7 would fall, and the black king would be. And then obviously, if f6 blocking the attack on g7, then queen takes b4, knight takes b4, bishop c3, and the game's steering towards a draw. There's not a lot of there's not a lot going on in this position. Knight d5, bishop b2, knight b6, rook d6, and then knight a4. Rook takes e6, knight takes b2, f4. This is just a way that the game could have went. As you can see, you have to be a little bit careful, because black is putting a lot of pressure and the white pieces haven't developed yet. And then he pins here, but white would have a really nice way of getting out of this. It would have been interesting for the game to actually have been played like this. But okay, this is all computer analysis, right? And at the end of the day, it actually just turns out to be equal, because white or black will have a rook and a pawn for a bishop and 3 pawns, and that would be impossible to win for either side. So in the game, what actually happened was an unbelievable move, bishop to g4. Now, the idea behind this move, because you're giving up a piece, is to attack the white king, which is still in the center, and eliminate defenders around the king. So as you can see, the immediate f takes g4 can be met by first attacking the white queen, which moves, and then there could be a double sacrifice actually here. starting with rook a1 check, bishop takes a1, rook c1, and notice the rook can't come back to d1 because it's pinned. The king's forced to e2, and then after the move e4, the white king is completely boxed in. Notice the rook cuts it off here, the pawn cuts it from going here. So now, no matter where the white queen goes, it can't stay on this diagonal, so it must leave that diagonal. If he goes to d4, then queen to b5 check is going to be mate. Or at the very least, significant loss of material, but I think it's actually mate. But white can't get out of this position. So in the game, white, after bishop g4, white did not take on g4 and decided to play bishop c3 instead. And given the fact that there's no longer a pin now on d2, black was pretty much forced to play queen a3. And the game ended in a draw after a repetition of moves 3 times. If the position occurs 3 times, then it's a draw, or the player can, making the position for the 3rd time, can claim a draw. So bishop to b2. Notice that if white would have been too ambitious and played bishop takes e5, then after bishop takes f3, which attacks the rook and also makes the king on e1 vulnerable, say rook g1, rook f to c8, white would actually be losing here, as there would be no way to defend the back rank from the ensuing threats. Okay, so that was that game. Let's go ahead and close that one up. All right. We had the American players. Fabiano Caruana, currently second highest rated player in the world at 2803, against Hikaru Nakamura. Both are multi-time United States champions. And it's definitely interesting to see how this one was going to play out. All right, just bear with me 1 second. I want to make sure that have everything under control. All right, let's get started. Fabiano Caruana was playing white. Hikaru Nakamura was playing black. Game started e4. Nakamura plays what's called the Sicilian defense, c5. White plays knight f3. Black plays d6. White plays d4. This is what's called the open Sicilian. And the reason why it's called the open Sicilian is because some pawns get traded and there ends up being half open files for both sides. Black will have, okay, so after c takes d4, knight takes d4. The point is that white has the half open d file that he'll be able to use for the rooks later, and black has the half open c file that he'll be able to use for his rooks. So very Sicilian games usually tend to be very sharp. Nakamura plays knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4. And white defends, knight c3. Black plays the move e5. Okay, so e5 in this position, it's interesting because Fabiano and Hikaru have had a number of Najdorfs, which the move a6 is the popular Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. played by, Bobby Fischer and Gary Kasparov, uh, and many others. But, those two being famous world champions, some of the best players in history. Um, I just wanted to make a brief note of this because Fabiano and Hikaru have played a good number of Nydorfs in their life, and it's not worked out very well for Hikaru when he was playing the black pieces. So he strays away from playing the Nydorf, plays the move e5, which tend to lead to similar positions to the Nydorf, but not precisely the same. It's known here that the only way to really play for any kind of refutation or advantage to this move e5, which would normally transpose to a lot of other lines, is to play the move bishop to b5. This is the move that Fabiano plays in the game. Hikaru responds with knight bd7, and what this does by making this check on b5 is it allows white to move the knight to f5, which would normally be, probably chopped off by the bishop. But the pin is allowing this knight to be on f5, and the knight's annoying on f5 because it keeps black from developing because the g7 pawn's under attack, and he's also immediately threatening to play knight takes d6 and win a pawn. So black had to react very quickly and played a6 to break the pin. Now there's no time for knight takes d6 because we're attacking the bishop on b5. So Fabiano plays bishop to a4. Notice that if bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, you're giving black the bishop pair. Fabiano was probably not interested in this. And the d6 square is now adequately protected. So after the move bishop to a4, Nakamura chose the move b5, driving the bishop back to b3, and then followed by knight c5. So now he's protecting the pawn on d6. He's also attacking the bishop on b3 and attacking pawn on e4. So multi-purpose moves. You're defending and attacking. Very important in chess to make multi-purpose moves. So here white plays the move bishop g5, which pins. So he's basically preventing white from taking on e4 because this knight is pinned. So notice if this knight took on e4, white could take back with this knight and he wouldn't be able to recapture because the knight's pinned. So that's the point. Both sides are making developing moves that address the threats being made by their opponent. Bishop takes f5 was played because that knight is just, you do have to get rid of that knight. That knight cannot continue to live on f5. Playing the move g6 is way too risky because your dark squares are already weak, and then you would be just weakening them even more. So what he does do is he gives white the bishop pair temporarily, but obviously this knight staring at b3, that bishop may not survive long. In fact, I thought that it was interesting if black would have taken on b3, but I don't think that this is very good because the particular problem in this position is for white after a takes b3. Since the rook on a8 is undefended, not only is white threatening knight to d5 to clamp up on f6 knight that's pinned, but he's also threatening knight takes b5. That's the problem, as the a6 pawn wouldn't be able to recapture due to the pin. So after bishop takes e5, e takes f5, Nakamura develops bishop e7, and here Caruana, realizing a sense of urgency, plays bishop takes f6. Now, if he would have castled, he wouldn't have got much out of the position. For instance, black castles, bishop takes f6, knight d5, Black has a very nice move here, e4. And the idea of this is to basically play on the dark squares as black, which is a very popular way to counterattack. And for instance, if c3 to defend the pawn on b2, then Nakamura could choose from a number of lines to press forward with some counterplay. I was looking particularly at moves like a5, threatening to, basically break up the queen side with a4, a3, and try to increase the scope of this bishop attacking the queen side. So white should probably play a3 himself, but after, like rook e8, bishop c2, rook e5, black seems to have pretty good position with no problem. So in the game, Fabiano chose bishop takes f6. And by the way, that was a GM game that ended up white winning, but black could have certainly improved on the and these players here probably know that game. They're probably familiar with it for preparation purposes. So bishop takes f6, castle. Now there's so many different things that white can do here. He can literally put any of these pieces on d5 in this position. So in the game, he opted for castling, but he could have went so many other ways. One position that I thought that would have been interesting. Well, let's just take a look at some of the ways. For instance, if he would have played queen d5, this threatens mate. So black's obliged to castle, and then he could have played knight to e4. But that's satisfactorily met by queen a5 check. So always taking advantage of what your opponent doesn't do. So white hasn't castled yet, so we play queen a5 check. And there was a GM game that went that way. And after king e2, queen b4, attacking the knight on e4 twice. It became a crazy game. King f3. I'll stop there because I think you see the point that black is obviously getting a lot of counterplay. So I don't think we need to continue with that variation. White could have also, in this position, instead of knight e4, played castle, directly attacking the pawn d6. But so the problem here is after rook c8, exclamation mark, queen takes d6, black has the move queen a5. And all of a sudden, threatening to trap the white queen with rook f to d8. The white queen wouldn't have any moves. So he has to play queen to d5 so that he can come backwards if rook d8. And after knight b3, he has to actually play queen takes b3 to stop b4 and queen takes a2. So for instance, if a takes b3, queen a1, king d2, queen takes b2, black is completely winning. Rook f d8's threatened, queen takes c3's threatened. The knight on c3 can't move because of the pawn on c2, and that would be a complete disaster. So white has to be careful, actually, because black's counterplay can come very swiftly. So I thought this was pretty good preparation by Nakamura's team. I don't think that it's something that he should play again. I think it was aimed directly for Fabiano. Highly doubtful that he would play this line again in this tournament. It was very important for him in this first round to start off with a draw against Fabiano, who has particularly been pretty successful against Hikaru with white pieces. In this game, Nakamura continued with e4, which is a novelty. We've seen that in some of the other lines. If black would have just castled in this position after knight d5, white and just about every grandmaster game won this position with white, because you pretty much, for instance, if knight takes b3, a b3, you're left with a superior minor piece. The knight on d5 tends to dominate this bishop, and a lot of the lines with like Sveshnikov ideas with like bishop to g5, they don't work out well here because white has um, pretty much this pawn on f5 pretty much cramps the black position, and there would be a timely f5 to f6 move that would kind of just break your king side apart. So that idea wouldn't particularly work in this type of position. So instead, Nakamura chooses e4 wisely. This is preparation, I'm sure. Then after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, rook e1, black castles. So Nakamura regains the pawn b2 after rook b1, bishop to f6. What needs to be said about this position is a lot of players would tend to think that since you have the opposite colored bishops, the position tends to be drawish. But the problem with that frame of mind is it's farthest from the truth. Whenever the heavy pieces are on the board, the bishops of opposite color is actually an advantage to the player that's attacking. So in this position, there was never any doubt that white was for choice, that white was the one that was pressing, because this bishop, if you compare the bishops for a second, the bishop on f6 and the bishop on b3, the bishop on f6, if it could have been on e5, or let's say d4, and been secure on this diagonal. But the problem with that is that this f5 pawn would be able to be used as a lever for an attack by throwing itself eventually to f6. And, black wouldn't be able to secure the king side. So the bishop can't be on the diagonal that it wants. But this bishop on b3, however, is always aiming at f7, always constantly threatening to the black position. And for, quite a long period of time, it's hard for black to even move the rook on f8. In this position, Fabiano went for queen to d5, which I thought was an inaccuracy. What I would have preferred to do is white in this position would play bishop to d5 and keep the options open for the queen. So after, say, rook c8, you can play this move c4. And I thought that it was interesting because after, say, b takes c4, rook takes, you exchange off the best of black's rooks. After bishop takes c4, white's left straddled, or black's left straddled with these three weaknesses: a6, d6, and f7. The queen can come to b3 or d5. It seems to me like it would be very difficult for black to defend all these weaknesses. It's possible that he could, but it seems to me like that it would eventually fall apart. It would seem to me like the better choice. But in the game, he played queen d5, and after rook c8, he went for this queen b7 idea. So he is harassing the white queen side by attacking the pawn on a6 and keeping pressure on the pawn on f7. So Nakamura, I thought Nakamura from this point on played amazing overall. Maybe not every move, but his ideas from this point on were just what you needed to do to achieve a counterplay. You cannot save the pawn on a6, so he didn't try to. He tries to counterattack. Rook c5. It was also, the computer suggested the move d5, which was very interesting because you cannot play bishop takes d5 because of the move rook c7, which breaks your defense of the bishop on d5. So queen takes a6, queen takes d5, for example. Um, and if the queen takes on d5, well, you just exchange queens, and then the position has the quality of being drawish because all that's left is rooks and bishops. So attacks against the king, I'm not going to say they're impossible, but just less likely. So in the game, after queen b7, rook c5, Fabiano snatches the pawn. Hikaru takes the pawn on f5. Now you notice that the black's pawns on d6 and b5 are much weaker than the counterparts on a2 and c2. Okay, which I illustrate here. The bishop on b3 is superior to the bishop on f6 because the bishop on f6 is not attacking anything. It's kind of a liability, in fact. You always have to be careful that white doesn't sacrifice on f6. And then the pawns on d6 and b5 are much weaker. Rook on f5 defends the pawn on b5 for now, but it looks super awkward. Rooks don't really belong in the middle of the chessboard with all the pieces on the board. So there was a lot of things that could have happened here. Fabiano chose rook d1. He's attacking the pawn d6, so Nakamura moves the pawn to d5, attacking the white rook on e4. And now rook to b4 was played. I thought that Nakamura he plays bishop c3, which was an inaccuracy. Now it did lead to what occurred in the game, which ends up being very difficult for white to find the winning path. But Nakamura did have a better move here. He had queen e7. The idea behind this move is if now white would take with the rook on b5, black in fact has this move queen e2, and all of a sudden black is completely winning with a double attack on the rook on d1 and the pawn on f2. So for instance, if rook f1, defending both of those threats, then there's this fantastic mating net with rook takes f2, rook takes f2, queen e1, rook f1, bishop d4, which I had the same mating net one many years ago in a tournament game. As I'm sure probably many players have. So that's a trap that you always have to watch out for. And after queen e7, if Fabiano would have taken with the queen instead, there comes this nice move, bishop to c3 now. And the difference is after rook a4, he has this move, bishop to e1. Pretty amazing conception. Attacking the pawn on f2, and this is precisely the types of things that you have to look for in opposite color bishop middle games, because these things just, look at the pieces on the queen side. Queen b5, rook a4, bishop b3. We boxed out the bishop on b3. White went pawn hunting, and now black is going king hunting. After queen d3, bishop takes f2, king h1. Black has his share of the chances. It's pretty much a balanced position. And honestly, white has to be very careful here not to lose. So there was that queen e7 would have been a very nice find. But instead, Nakamura after bishop c3, rook b5 finds this very nice rook takes f2 idea. Now, it's not, it doesn't work if white plays extremely precisely. But the idea in and of itself, pretty amazing, and just the type of thing that you need to look for to try. Now, obviously, Nakamura, after playing rook takes f2, is not trying to win the game. He's trying to give a perpetual check. He's trying to make a draw. So Fabiano correctly plays rook b takes d5. Obviously, if he would have taken the rook on f2, After queen h4, king g1, bishop d4, king h1, bishop d5. The threat of mating on h2, what it does is it allows, but by black creating this threat, it allows the king to be opened up. He has to play g3, bishop takes g3, threatening mate again on h2. And after rook d2, defending queen e4, there's no way to escape the checks. Rook g2, queen e1, rook g1, etc. So in the game after rook bd5, Nakamura plays queen h4, queen to d3. Nice move, attacking the bishop on c3. Very accurate. Now Nakamura finds very precise. Rook f6. So he has ideas of playing rook h6. He has ideas of playing queen f2, which would lead to mate. He's actually threatening mate. Or I'm sorry, he's not threatening mate. But if white was to take the bishop on c3, this would be mate as follows. So in the game, white Fabiano plays g3. Very accurate. Now queen to b4, king to g2. And I thought here Fabiano probably missed what appeared to me, at least, to be a winning idea to play the move rook f1. It had been very difficult for black to hold on here, I thought. For instance, queen b6, king g2, queen c6. White has the move queen c4, which takes the queens off, and obviously these pawns on a2 and c4 are going to be a powerhouse now as they run down the board. So it's very important for black to keep the queens on the board, but I thought that was hard to do after rook to f1. The queen's currently hitting this, or protecting the bishop on c3, and so it's very difficult. I looked at a lot of different lines there. So here, bishop to b2 was played after king g2. And now Fabiano makes another slight inaccuracy, rook f5, after which g takes. Now here, Fabiano did have a chance to play rook to b5. And this again after queen e7, bishop to d5, attacks the bishop on b2. And now this piece is optimal, and he would like to play rook to b7 and put more pressure on f7. And I thought that white had, and now obviously the pawns are getting mobilized, and I thought that black would have found it difficult to hold this position, frankly. But in the game, they decided to Fabiano decided to exchange, and that was pretty much clear at this point that the game was most likely going to steer towards a draw. Since one pair of rooks got traded, there's not as much of a threat to f7 is kind of the point. a4, king g7, a5, he starts to move the pawn, but Nakamura already has this pretty much figured out. He can pretty much just set up a fortress. Rook to d5 was tried. Rook a7, rook b5, queen d8. And there's always going to be threats to the white king because it's too exposed. Rook d5, queen c7, h4. And he grabs the pawn on a5. Rook takes queen b7. And he rightfully assessed here that even though he's losing the pawn on f7, that white won't be able to stop the checks on his king. Queen d8, queen f7, king h6. Very nice. Really just a very well played game, particularly by Nakamura. He defended extremely well. All right, let's move on to the last game. Which was the most exciting game of the round. Unbelievable game, honestly. So we had a Spanish, and the Spanish Roy Lopez starts off as follows. This is the starting position of what's called the Spanish opening, or Roy Lopez. In this position, uh, so we had Alireza Faruja, who's currently residing in France. He is native Iranian flag player, but because of political things, he defected and now lives in France. And then you had Pragnananda, who's a young Indian player, very talented. Him and his sister are actually both playing in the Bashali is his sister. They're both playing. Bashali's playing in the women's candidates tournament in the same venue alongside her brother. So it's pretty cool. A6, bishop A4, knight F6, castle, and knight takes E4 is what's known as the open Spanish. What do I mean by that? Well, the position tends to be open after you take this pawn on E4 because eventually white's going to play rook E1 and there's a half open file. As you remember earlier, I talked about the difference between a closed Sicilian as opposed to an open Sicilian position. Same thing with the Spanish. You're not some pawns are getting traded and some files are being opened. So this is the open Spanish. Um, just as a sideline, bishop e7, rook e1. This is what's called d6 c3. Sorry, castle h3. This is what's called a closed Spanish because, as you can see, there is no open files yet. There will be, but that's why this is referred to as the closed Spanish. So in the game, after knight takes e4, no, black is not winning a pawn because it's well known that white gets this pawn back. He played d4, and the idea behind this move is that you're not only threatening to play d5 and win the pawn on e5, but you're pretty much forcing black to play the way he does in the game with b5, bishop b3, d5, because if he plays e takes d4, then rook e1 pins the knight to the king. And you may say, well, can't black defend the pawn or the knight on e4 with the move d5? And what happens is after knight takes d4, white regains that pawn and also has a double attack. Not only is he threatening knight takes c6, but you're also threatening to move f2, f3, pinning the knight on e4 to the king. So you don't want to go down those lines. That would be losing in the game. Pragnananda plays b5, bishop b3, d5, d takes e5. This is the open Spanish. This is the main line. White regains the pawn, and he has what I consider to be a slight advantage because you have pressure on d5. You have a little bit more central control, and the dark squares around the black queen side. Now, with that being said, even though white has a slight advantage, as he does in most openings anyway, black has good piece play and chances to, to turn the tables. So, black needs to first equalize. And Karpov used to play this a lot, particularly against Kasparov. And they had many battles. So here, bishop d6 is obligatory. You have to defend this pawn d5 as black. White plays the move c3. This move is aimed at controlling the d4 square and preparing to play, like, in the middle game, bishop to e3, knight bd2, bishop to c2. I'll draw some arrows here to kind of give you the outline of the pieces. But you're trying to control these weakened black squares, okay? So you're trying to play moves like bishop e3, bring the bishop back to c2 to question this knight's position. This knight will come to d2, then to b3, and eventually after b4, maybe the knight on b3 comes to like say c5, to find a home on these an outpost on these weak and dark squares. But in the game, bishop e7 was played, bishop c2, and bishop g4, which is typical. So black threatening to take the pawn on e5 because of the pin on the knight. And for the longest time, um, it was thought that white probably didn't have anything better than to play h3, bishop takes, g takes f3, not queen takes f3 because knight takes e5, but g takes f3 hits the knight on e4, and he's forced backwards. And this position was, hitting the pawn on h3, play queen f3. This was, thought to be the best that white had, and honestly, it wasn't much of an advantage. So in the game, after bishop g4, instead of playing h3, Firouzja plays the move queen e1. Interesting move. So he's attacking the knight on e4 twice. He sidesteps the pin on the knight, or on the queen, by the knight. And he pretty much forces Praggnanandhaa now to play knight c5. He could have played bishop takes f3, but after gf3, knight c5, b4, knight a4, f4, queen d7. This was pretty much a game that was played between Arian Tari, grandmaster from Norway, and Vishy Anand, former world champion from India. And after a series of moves here, Vishy Anand found a way to make a quick draw by perpetual check. Had a very nice very nice sacrifice there. Knight takes c3. That because the whole idea here is that white is too exposed, and the queens can't protect the king against perpetual check, and after knight takes c3, knight d4, so he can't protect the bishop on c2 and the exposed light squares. So with that being said, after knight c5, queen e1, knight c5, knight bd2, knight e6. And now I found this in the database because the only move that was really considered in chess-based analysis in this position was the move queen e2, which I just thought was just a weird fucking move. I didn't even understand queen e2, to be truthful, because it just seems like you're just like putting the queen back in a pin. There could be knight f4s or d4s. This move just seems very strange. I didn't even fully understand why that somebody would think that this novelty, queen e2. As you can see here, this is not my analysis. This came from ChessBase. Why that this would be anything special. But in the game, Alireza did not play queen e2. And he chose king h1. And this is very, very deep. So this was a novelty, I do believe. Let me double check. I didn't put novelty, but I think I just forgot to put novelty. Oh, okay. Okay, so this wasn't a novelty. This had been played by Duvaris, and I have the game here. So that's why I didn't put novelty. But there was a novelty in this game, but it just occurred after bishop to h5. So in this position, there was a game between Duvaris and Kumar, from 1999, 25 years ago, that went knight g1. And after bishop g6, bishop to b1, very strange. You see all the white pieces going to the back rank. Very strange. Knight f4, queen e3, bishop g5. I mean, black played a horrible game here. He was totally outclassed by like 270 points. The white player was 2590, black was 2321. So this game's not much to draw off of because there was just too many mistakes played by black. But so Alvarez didn't find knight to g1 very appealing. He found, I'm sure, in preparation, the move knight to b3, which kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying earlier about just targeting these dark squares. And in this case, not so much targeting, but just keeping control and influence over, key dark squares here on the queen side and in the center. So what happens in the game is black takes him up on his offer to crush the king side. Bishop takes f3, gf3. Now, ultimately, the question is the kings. Like, the king's safety becomes a huge question in this game. So bishop g5, very natural move. Not really anything else that black can do that's active, because white controls the dark squares with the pawns. So rook g1, bishop c1, knight c1. It's important to maneuver this knight back to e2 because this knight needs to have influence over the center and the king side. There was not much that it was going to do on the queen side. For instance, if rook takes c1, could have played queen h4 and then queen f to 4. And particularly the queen's getting traded off here would have just, pretty much killed the position. There wouldn't have been much of a chance for instance, you cannot just take, I didn't analyze this earlier, but for instance, you can't really do this because for one, the e5 pawn's hanging, but you also might just be getting, it's very iffy if you're even getting the rook trapped with king f8 there. So knight takes c1, queen h4, rook to g4. Very important move. The rook's playing a very active role in defending various threats that black had on white's fourth rank. There could be some d4 coming. There could have been knight f4. Just all various threats on the fourth rank. So the rook on g4 does a good job of protecting, not allowing black's pieces to just stir around the king side. Queen h5, knight d3, protects e5 because as you noticed that black was threatening knight takes e5. So knight d3 has the advantage of protecting e5 and f4, but it does make this bishop look kind of strange on c2. Castle, and then queen e2. So in the live broadcast, a lot of players were looking at queen e3, but queen e3 might have been a mistake because what happens here is the move f5. And after, say, if white wanted to play knight f4 in this position, after knight takes, rook takes f4, rook a to e8, it's not even possible to defend the pawn on e5. So white would probably be much worse in this position. And after f5, e takes f6, rook f6, rook g1, g6, knight c5, take, king h8, f4, rook a to f8. This position's unclear. I could clearly see why that Alvarez didn't want to go for this because this is, this could go wrong very easily. Yeah, I don't blame Alvarez for avoiding this at all. So instead of playing queen e3, he played the move queen e2. And, there's some hidden phantom threats of like f4 and maybe someday, sacrificing this rook to get this queen, but they are phantom at the moment. And after queen e2, uh, f5 was played, e takes f6, rook takes f6, f4. Now, I thought these next couple moves by Alvarez very precise because he realized that after this rook gets to f6, that black wants to checkmate him on h2. And rather than to fall into complete passivity and a dangerous initiative to black, he thought that it was very useful to put f4 and the pawn on f3. So the queen defends h2 laterally, but then these pawns on f4 and f3 are defending many key squares and kind of propping the position up. Also, as you'll see later, the pawn on f4 has quite a few chances to move to f5 and gain a winning advantage. So let's see how that all played out. Rook to f8, queen f2, a little bit of an inaccuracy. It would have been more prudent to, like, say, move the rook to the e file first. And one line that I looked at was like, say, now in this position, what white wants to do, the plan, is to play queen to d2 and then move the knight to e5, because then the queen would be attacking the pawn on d5, maybe even coupled with a timely bishop to b3. And for that reason, maybe if rook ff6. But now what happens is after knight e5, or not knight e5, knight takes f4, I guess, in that position. After queen to d2, rather, black has nothing better. So this is coming. Knight to e5 is coming. Queen takes d5, and the black king's going to be the one in trouble. So in this position, black had nothing better to play queen h3, threatening to take on f3. But after rook to g2, this position is suddenly very, very difficult for black, because white's threatening this maneuver knight f2 with tempo, and then knight g4 forking the rooks. So very interesting. If queen takes f3, bishop to d1, queen h3, knight f2, queen h4, and he has knight to g4, but even stronger is queen takes d5. So that's a very nice line. Rook to e1, seemingly, both players were in time pressure by this point. Didn't have a lot of time left for the game. I do remember that. So here, instead, Alireza plays queen f2, and now the black rook can't really move away from h6 because of this threat, rook h4. He plays rook f to f6, and then after rook to e1, black plays queen f7. Now a slight inaccuracy, queen to g3. It was better to leave this queen flexible. I know that he's attacking the pawn here, but what white should have done is counterattack with bishop to b3. This would have been a very, very nice. And then if rook h5, defending d5. Can't remember my analysis here. Could turn the engine on, but I'd like to. Pretty complicated. But I think basically you move this rook to g1. It's very very double-edged position. A lot of stuff going on here. In the game, Alireza played queen g3, rook to h5. He wants to potentially just Well, he's defending d5, but he'd like to get something to f5. And he's also stopping white from playing f5 himself. Then the move a4 came, trying to probe at the queen side, create some kind of weakness over there. Rook f to h6, rook to e2, defending h2, rook to h3, queen to e1. Now, rook takes f3 was a huge mistake. However, Alireza didn't fully take advantage. It was better for black to play queen h5 and keep pressure on h2, prevent white from doing anything active with these pieces here. Then if, like, say, rook gg2, black can play the move knight e7, bring the knight to f5, king g1, rook g6, take, king f1, queen h5, rook f2. This would have probably ended up being a draw. Not really much. If anybody's better here, it's probably black. But rook takes f3, huge mistake. Knight to c5, bam. It was just a shame that Alireza didn't have enough time to finish this, because I think he had the right conception. He had the right idea. He just didn't bring it to fruition because of the lack of time. Queen h5, knight takes e6. The winning move started with rook eg2, hitting g7. So it's impossible for black to take on c5 because he's getting mated as follows. Okay, so the knight on c5 is immune after rook eg2. And if black plays a move like queen f7, white has very strong f5. And now the knight on e6 is obliged to move. That would be winning for white. If instead of queen f7, he does have the move knight to e5, which is an amazing conception. Obviously, white can't take with pawn because of queen f7 threatening rook f1. If bishop d3, knight c5, rook g7, queen g7. I mean, this is pretty amazing variation. But at the end of the day, the two rooks should hold. But the weakness of the black king is pretty apparent there, but should hold that position. But backing up, after queen g3, rook h5, I'm sorry, we're way ahead of that. After knight to c5 by Alireza, move queen h5, knight takes e6, queen takes g4, knight to g5, and black finds the savior. Knight e5. He could have also played knight e7. It's basically the same idea, because white can't break through, as there's always a perpetual check if this knight on f3 or g5 is leaves, or if the rook on e2 leaves. So, for instance, rook takes e5, rook takes h2, king h2, queen h5, king g2, and we just have a repetition of position. Perpetual check. There was really nothing that white could do to avoid it. For instance, bishop h7, rook h7, rook e5, same fate, same check, perpetual. And bishop to b3 is very keenly met by c6. And actually, in this position, White has to be careful not to lose. So he's kind of obliged to take on e5 and allow the perpetual check. Okay, that's the end of round one. All four games were draws. It's going to be exciting. The thing about this first round was you had the um, the Indians playing each other, the Americans playing each other, the Azerbaijani player playing the Russian player. Um, they did that in the first round to avoid any chances of any type of collusion, is my understanding. So we got the friendly countries paired up against each other out of the way in round one. Not that the players, by any means, these all seem, with the exception of maybe Abasov and the Pomniachi, all the other games were pretty contested games, all ending in draws. So stay tuned for round two tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Enjoy.